Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Black Mental Health Matters. I'm Dr. Kenyan Williams, and this is a show that's about everything related to mental wellness in the Black community and beyond. So today I have a guest with me, Dr. Jana Robina Onwong'a, and she hails from Baltimore, Maryland. She was raised in PG County and has roots in Kenya, East Africa. She received her bachelor's in psychology, French language and literature, and international studies from the University of Maryland. In January of 2022, so just last month, she successfully defended her dissertation entitled Healing While Black in the U.S., an exploration of adverse childhood experiences, ethnic identity, psychological sense of community, and complete mental health. And then this summer of 2022, she will graduate with her PhD in counseling psychology from the University of Missouri. Dr. Onwong'a is a performance growth and wellness-driven behavior and social scientist who supports individuals and organizations. In particular, she aims to develop and implement culturally affirming and sustainable interventions to aid in healing the global Black community. So welcome to the show, Dr. Onwong'a.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be here and to be able to just be in conversation with you more about mental health and specifically as it relates to the Black immigrant community.
Great. And so for listeners out there, as I was kind of doing some research, I came across this article. It's called AmeriKenyan, Lived Acculturation and Ethnic Identification of Kenyan Natives During Their Youth. And it's a qualitative study that investigated 6 Kenyan emerging adults or adolescents who described their immigration experience and their acculturation process and their ethnic and racial identity and things like that. And as I was reading through it, it kind of made me think about my own journey as a Jamaican who moved to the US at age 17. So I looked up the author, who was Dr. Onwong'a, and invited her to come on the podcast to talk a little bit about her study. There's 3 authors to the study, but she was a lead author. I wanted her to come and, talk a little bit about the work that she did and kind of have a discussion, So Dr. Onwong'a, why did you choose to write a paper like this, specifically about the Kenyan adolescent experience and within voluntary immigration?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, when you read out my bio, that I am Kenyan. I was born in Baltimore, raised in the US, but to Kenyan parents. And I feel very connected to my culture and I love my people. And just growing up in that community, I wanted to be able to highlight some of the experiences that we have when we are living in the US, or for some, whether they're in other places where we consider the diaspora at large as Black immigrants. And so I just wanted to be able to put a spotlight on the experiences that Black youth who are Kenyan and who are living in a different culture from their home culture are experiencing.
So there's this term, AmeriKenyan. Who is an AmeriKenyan?
So it's a term that I picked up just from like conversations with friends growing up. It's a term that's heard a lot amongst the Kenyan emerging adult community in the US. And I would define it as one, I would define myself as an AmeriKenyan. I have roots in Kenya, was born in the US, and still feel connected to my culture. And then also for the folks who were in my study who were born in Kenya, but immigrated to the US at an early age. So they kind of are, multicultural, bicultural individuals in that way, because they would consider themselves as American, but they also consider themselves as Kenyan.
Wow. So it's a joint identity,
Yeah.
Kenyan, AmeriKenyan. Very clever. It's and for Jamaicans, I think we use the term Jamaican.
I've heard that as well. Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about this idea of acculturating and what it's like for, I guess, what do you think about, before we kind of launch into the study, what is acculturation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I sent you over a visual for those people who are able to see the YouTube, but if not, if you're listening in, I'll just kind of describe what it is. So this visual helps me to understand what acculturation is, and this was defined by Barry and Sam. And so acculturation has 4 different components to it. There's integration, assimilation, separation, and marginalization. The assimilation part of it, the assimilation part of it talks about basically individuals who don't wish to maintain their heritage culture and they want to become fully involved in the larger society. So as you can see with the questions, is it important to maintain cultural identity and characteristics? For those who are assimilating, that's not very important for them. But they do want to maintain relationships with the dominant society. So they're trying to, make both of them work. Integration, is it important for them to maintain their cultural identity and characteristics? Yes, it is. It's also important for them to maintain relationships with dominant society. And then with marginalization, this is the exact opposite of integration. So this reflects that they have very little interest in either the heritage culture. So they want to maintain and connect with dominant culture. So folks who are experiencing marginalization, they don't find it important to maintain cultural identity and characteristics, nor do they find it important to maintain relationships with dominant society. So as the term kind of infers, they're on the outskirts or the margin of society in a way. And then separationists, they exist within their ethnic people. They have a place where they're holding on to their original culture. And at the same time, they don't really care too much to interact with the dominant culture. So in essence, they're rejecting majority culture. We see this a lot with older adults. So, people like parents of first generation immigrants, they may not care too much to buy into American culture, and they're kind of holding on to what their roots are.
Wow. So this is, and this is something that's not necessarily specific just to Kenyan immigrants. This is just a acculturation process that would happen for any immigrant that was kind of coming to, moving from one place to another place. There's this kind of 4 different ways that you can acculturate.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone who is trying to manage, at least 2 majority cultures in whatever place they're moving to might go through this process. And, kind of like with my study, there are individuals who are experiencing some sort of psychological outcome, whether it be dis-ease because of the implications that acculturating has.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the kind of unique cultural factors that, Kenyan immigrants might be kind of thinking about or dealing with their experience in the U.S. Again, before we kind of go into the kind of study in general, just general things to think about for someone coming from Kenya and coming to the U.S.
Yeah. Before I answer that, I'm sorry, I'm going to grab my charger because I just got a notification.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah, and kind of just looking at the study, it does talk about Kenya being a diverse nation made up of like 50 million people, drawn from over 70 distinct ethnic groups and different linguistic groups, and how that also kind of plays into what it's like to then move into a culture like the U.S.
Yeah. So some of the would say unique cultural factors that I've picked up on, and I mentioned some of them in the manuscript that influence their immigration experience include moving from a culture that is more collectivistic, a lot more family oriented, into an individualistic culture. In the US, the values don't typically include the same collectivistic or kin oriented aspects that Kenyan culture and a lot of other Black cultures on the continent or in the Caribbean do. And then there's also that adjustment from them being the majority race in their country and now moving to the US where they're considered a racial and ethnic minority in society. And then also just some another kind of traditional aspect is for parents, specifically fathers who are used to living in a patriarchal family structure where power distance, which is basically the emphasis or on equality of power and status difference in relationships. So the power distance between parents and children is usually pretty high or far. And this is something that a lot of parents have to adjust to when they're moving to US culture, which in some ways encourages more autonomy than the traditional Kenyan tribes and cultures do.
Okay. So a lot of different factors
Hmm.
to kind of consider, and it's interesting as you mentioned them. I've seen it kind of play out even as a psychiatrist working with teenagers that
Yeah,
growing up in the U.S., but in the household there's a different culture that's kind of represented in the household.
yeah.
So tell us about the study that you did.
So this was my master's study, like my first big project that I did on my own in graduate school. And I had the support of my advisor, Dr. Slayton, and then one of the other professors in my program here at Mizzou, Dr. McLean, also was able to jump on and help me to kind of wrap up the manuscript and bring in some Black psychology perspectives into it. So the questions that I basically was asking in my manuscript were, what are the salient issues related to Kenyan immigrants transition to the US as adolescents? So all my participants were basically answering retrospectively based on what they remembered their experiences being like when they first moved to the US, like around that adolescent age group. And then also, how do Kenyan immigrants describe their acculturation experience that occurred from the time when they were adolescents to being emerging adulthood? So that would be around middle school age to like college and a bit post-college age range. And then I also wanted to know like what role acculturation played in their social, academic, and emotional life experiences during that time. And then lastly, I was also asking how they understood their ethnic identity during their adolescence and also in their emerging adulthood at the time that I was interviewing them.
And how many people participated in your study?
So I had actually 7 participants, and one of them I didn't officially include the data because they were outlier. They didn't really fit into the age range that I was intending to collect from, but they all provided very valuable information in the study, and it was qualitative. So a lot of listening to their story, combing through the data, and finding themes of what was relevant to the questions that I asked.
No, this is great. And I know that whereas, if you do a qualitative study and it's 6 people, that it may not be fully generalizable, but I feel like it's a great springboard for discussion.
Yeah.
Because, as someone, again, reading the article, I can see myself in some of the responses. So I know that there are a lot of people out there that may have a similar feeling or a similar experience. So tell us a little bit about, tell us a little bit about, the study questions and what you guys were looking for. So all the folks in the study would identify themselves as AmeriKenyans pretty much.
Mhm. Yeah.
And were they from like various places in the US, or were they mostly from like, the city that you were in?
Yeah, for sure. So they did all identify with the term, and they came from different parts in the U.S. So there was an individual from the north, or a couple individuals from the Northeast, South, Midwest, as well as West Coast, and so different geographical regions in the U.S. But all of them who participated happened to be living in ethnic enclaves. And ethnic enclaves is a term that comes up in like the sociology literature that basically talks about individuals living in communities that have a high population of their similar cultural group. So in Jersey City, there's a lot of Kenyans. In Dallas, there's a lot of Kenyans. In Minnesota, we see a lot of Kenyans, also Somali. So there's different areas in the US where folks who are coming from a certain place like hear of them. I think in the U.S. Or in New York, Brooklyn, Bronx, those are big ones too for a lot of like Caribbean population. So there's places where you can see examples of certain groups kind of coming together because they already know like, okay, I have like my people there that I can go to and feel comfortable. I think Miami is a good place too in terms of like thinking of like Haitian community and things like that. So yeah, they lived in ethnic enclaves, different areas of the U.S. There were 3 women, 3 men. And what was the other question that you asked me in terms of participants?
Oh, you answered the question. I was going to follow up and say, what about in terms of their Kenyan roots, was
Mm,
there a diversity in terms of their Kenyan roots, or did
yeah,
it
yeah.
be kind of from similar backgrounds?
Yeah, so what I saw was that they came from a few of the like larger, more well-known tribes in Kenya. So there are folks who identified with the Kisi tribe, Kikuyu tribe, Luo as well, and Kamba tribe. And then some of them actually, they, interestingly enough, when I asked them an open-ended question, like, what is your race or identity? Some of them simply said, like, I'm Kenyan. You know, they didn't necessarily say what their ethnic group or what their tribe was because they identified just as Kenyan. And later down the line is when, you know, they brought in examples from their tribal group that may have been specific to their home experience.
So, tell us a little bit about, I guess, in general, some of the things you found in the study. Some of the responses you got, things that stood out to you.
Yeah, yeah. So the big themes that came up in, you know, the responses that they gave had to do with Kenyan immigration, acculturation, ethnic identity, and mental health. So when it comes to the immigration experience, participants talked a lot about feeling unprepared for the move. And then they brought up the ethnic enclave. So the feeling unprepared was, you know, kind of going back to that power distance. There was, you know, talk within the family of them maybe moving to the US, but as the children at that time, they weren't really kept abreast or, you know, factored into the decision of that. They were just kind of told, like, this is what's happening. For a couple of them, actually, they mentioned that, you know, whenever they got the message that they received visa, they, you know, bags were packed and they were pretty much gone like within a week's time. So different circumstances that brought them to the US, and most of them just felt unprepared for that experience, especially at a younger age. Those who did feel like they were a bit more prepared were ones who had already been living in Nairobi, which is the capital city, more of an economic hub in the country. So they felt like the transition wasn't as jarring as if they would have been still living more in their rural village area and transitioning to the culture in the US, which is a lot more fast paced and, as mentioned, very individualistic.
Wow. So the feeling of being unprepared and
Hmm.
kind of just moving very quickly, I think that is something a lot of immigrants can kind of resonate with. And so, you know, did people ever talk about like their expectations? Like, were there some that actually had expectations that, were the expectations met?
Yeah. So I think during that time, actually, a lot of keep in mind, a lot of them at the time that they immigrated, they were pretty young. So, you know, 10, 11, 12, 13 years old. And so the picture that they had of America in their mind. And I think we're going to talk about the American dream at some point, but the picture that they had in their mind of the US was from what they had seen, you know, on these popular shows that were being streamed in Kenya at the time. So they had an idea of what, you know, high school would look like, and jocks, as they were referred to on shows, or geeks sitting together. So just that kind of like stereotypical depiction that a lot of the shows from like the 2000s and 2010s used to put out there is what their idea was. And then they also had this idea that they were going to come and be able to just like have fun and have more freedom, not really thinking of the stresses that kind of go into that experience for them. And then just being children, they also felt underprepared for some of the ways that their race would kind of come into play too. And so we can talk about that a little bit when I bring up like the ethnic identity results too.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you know, sorry. I guess let's start off a little bit with the idea of academic acculturation.
Hmm.
So they're coming from their school system, and then they're joining the American school system.
Hmm.
And did any of them kind of talk a little bit about what that was like? And were any of them kind of recipients of academic scholarships, or mostly is it just kind of voluntary immigration and just, you know, starting school here?
Yeah. So that's a great question. All of them were voluntary immigrants via their parents having come here. And so just like a little bit of background for Kenya, the during like the 1950s and 60s, there was this term called the Airlift Generation or Airlift Africa, which was when students from East Africa arrived like by way of this initiative that the US and Canada had to bring in different scholars to, get education here. So just keeping in mind that the original kind of passageway for voluntary immigrants from Kenya at that time was because of education. That was still a very strong factor that played into parents continuing to move here and wanting their kids to also be in the US and settle in the US. So the academic component for participants, I actually didn't even think to ask that when I was doing my first couple interviews, but it was routinely brought up by the participants and without me even prompting. And so a couple of the participants reported like having a smooth transition and had more shared sentiments about it, feeling okay. And then there were several participants who mentioned the fact that their education that they had received in Kenya, because Kenya has the British system in place since they were formerly a British colony, they mentioned feeling overprepared when they were in the classes that they came into. They felt like they had already covered a lot of those things in their courses. However, their teachers and the US system, in its, like racist, microaggressive way, was putting them, even for some of them, they had to be held back because the assumption was that, oh, you're coming from Kenya, you're coming from Africa, you're not going to be able to keep up, or you're probably behind, or your English is probably not where it should be, ignorantly not realizing that that is one of their national languages and that they were very far ahead in a lot of the classes that they had. So several of them had mentioned, feeling overprepared, feeling frustrated in classes because they felt like the material was just a repeat of what they had learned, and basically having to navigate that space of people feeling like they were not well educated for the grade that they were in or supposed to be in.
Oh, and I, as I read through the article, I kind of see this general kind of sentiment of the people that were around kind of didn't really bother to learn anything about Kenya. They didn't really know much about African countries in general, and specifically not really much about Kenya. And so their idea of what education might be like there, or what people might know or not know, or their languages, was very rudimentary, and made a lot of, and unfortunately would affect school decisions too. You think that a school would probably kind of be a little bit more read up on some of those things. Talk about the role of like language. You brought up that people often made the assumption that if you have a strong accent and you're from an African country, it must be therefore that English is just not a strength for you. What were people's experiences with that?
Yeah, language was a big thing that came up because participants felt like, their English was advanced. That's the language they were using every day when they were in school. So the fact that they were adjusting now to a system where even, in their words, they felt like they had already learned the, quote unquote, British English, which was considered a bit more proper in their eyes, and now adjusting to slang. And then people feeling like, well, you're not really speaking proper English, or we don't understand you. It was very confusing for them to be getting those kind of remarks, or people treating them in that way. And that was one thing that they mentioned kind of played into some of their like self-doubt and the anxiety that they were experiencing. So sometimes not even necessarily wanting to speak up in the classroom and answer questions that they did know the answers to. Also not really wanting to engage in conversations with other folks who were outside of their cultural group. A lot of them mentioned that they felt more connected to other immigrants. So that's the kind of friends they were making in classes. So whether it was other immigrants who were from the Caribbean, or even if it was Latinx individuals, they just felt more connected to folks who had that shared identity of being an immigrant, who also had an accent, also spoke English, but also were being aggressed in those different ways because of their accents.
And did some of them also, maybe not unlike myself, just kind of start to adopt an American accent?
Yes. I actually kind of wrote about that too. There's this term that we use in the Kenyan community called twang. So it's kind of like when individuals are wanting to, or they're trying to speak in a more, quote unquote, Americanized accent, just kind of flatten out their tonnage and stuff. So yeah, there were individuals who, admitted to being wanting to assimilate in that way and adopting that accent, and to the point where they even stopped speaking their native tongue and Swahili within their households because they felt like that would hinder them from being able to speak to other American folks outside of the home.
Yeah, we use the same term in Jamaica too. It's all twanging. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, cool.
It's kind of like where you can literally still hear their native accent, but you can just hear that there's certain words that they try to pronounce differently and things like that.
Cool.
So it's very interesting how we kind of use the same terms.
So many like similarities across the our immigrant experiences.
I wanted to talk a little bit about this concept of the American dream. This idea that we can just, when you come to the US, there's like this expectation of what it's going to be like here. And as you mentioned, some of your participants were very young when they first came here.
Yeah.
But, with the study that you did, but also with just the research that you did on immigration, how do you feel like this concept of the American dream kind of played into the psychological experience of AmeriKenyans?
Yeah, there's this term in my family's tribal language, which is Kisi. They say, they use the word ngumbu, and ngumbu is kind of like, it's also a Bantu term because my people are Bantu. And it basically describes like going up there or going home or going to heaven. When people are describing, going to America, they often use that term. So it's this very idealized, it's just an idealized like experience, like, oh, we're going to go there, like things are going to be better. And to the point where participants mentioned that for example, one of them, one of their parents like moved over to the US and was kind of getting things, situated for them, and then brought the rest of the family over for the kids to be educated there. That parent was experiencing a high amount of stress, working multiple jobs, living in a very like small setting with other individuals, and they were able to move out and be able to bring their family and have their own like home at that point. But they did not share with their family how hard their experience was, because they were still wanting to have their family come, and they were believing that this was going to be a much better life for them in the long run. So the ways that we, even still perpetuate this narrative that like, oh, the US, it's the land of the free and the home of the brave, and there's so many opportunities here, while we also are not really shedding light on some of the racist and traumatic experiences that people have when they do come here, especially Black people. That was something that, was brought up by them. And it does affect their mental health because, one, they're not prepared for what they're going to experience with the culture shock. And then two, the racism that is pervasive, like within the school system, within their neighborhoods, the xenophobia that's occurring when they are not able to connect with different people, and people have a lot of like ignorant or they're not knowledgeable about the Kenyan culture or other immigrant cultures, then it affects their mental health in a pretty negative way.
Yeah. I kind of think about how, especially in this world of social media, where people do have a tendency to just post a highlight reel of their lives anyways. This idea of, oh, let me just kind of post the good things. Let me tell you about the good things. And when you kind of actually get here, you realize living in the US is, it has pluses and minuses, you know. And as you mentioned, that feeling of unpreparedness, I think that's a common thread. That's definitely a common thread. I remember reading a book actually. Oh my gosh, I don't even remember which book it was now. It was actually, in this particular case, it was not a voluntary immigrant. It was like a more of a refugee type immigration situation. But they were saying that prior to coming to the US, there was kind of like some weak attempt at preparing people for coming to the US. And there's like a video they had to watch or something, and how it was just not even sufficient for what they were going to experience when they came. And, you know, small apartment for their family, kind of navigating just a different setup for just almost every aspect of life. That there's some things that are universal, but still feel different because it's just, you know, it might be. And so I can see how, you know, folks that maybe lived in Nairobi before coming to the US, they may have felt better prepared, you know, because they've had to make this adjustment to different places, and it's kind of a different pace, major city. Then when they move to the US, they can say, okay, I've done some of these things in a very similar way. I'm familiar with some of these places, some of these stores, because I've been exposed to it.
Absolutely.
So there is I wanted to kind of talk about the idea of being Black in America, because it's one of the things that I had to think about too, is the idea of being Black as a racial identity and being Black as a cultural identity. And that when you're Black in America, the two things are kind of like united. You're Black as a racial identity and as a cultural identity. So when people talk about being Black, they're basically talking about both things concurrently most of the time. But when you're from somewhere else, being Black is a racial category, but it might not actually be your cultural identification. Your culture is your native culture. And so there's this, you kind of talk about this process where people have to adapt to the cultural identity in the country. So in the US, there's European American culture, and there is an African American culture. And people may not be aware that they kind of end up needing to, I don't know, kind of join with both cultures to survive.
There's a lot of psychological reframing that has to happen for individuals who are immigrating from a country where they are the culture, the majority race and ethnicity, and they're used to, at least for the most part, things being done in their cultural way. And so the way that I kind of talked about it in my paper too, with ethnic identity, when I brought in racial identity from a psychological perspective, I use a definition of it being the extent to where like someone's individual awareness and interpretation of their lived experience through that racial group. And unfortunately for AmeriKenyans or Kenyans who were born on the continent and then immigrated to the States, they have a pretty low awareness of their racial identity because they didn't really have to. They were living in a space where it was more, and I keep saying for the most part about them because of how colonization, the vestiges of that still impact us. So there's still a lot of like internalized anti-Blackness in ourselves and also just around the world. Like we're even seeing it now with what's going on with Africans being pushed out of or not being allowed to seek refuge, in Poland from Ukraine. And so it is a very important factor to consider. And for some of the participants, they reported that they didn't start to really understand what their racial identity was and how deep their Blackness was until they were like in their later high school years. So they did unfortunately experience a lot of bullying, discrimination, like xenophobic comments coming from white and Black peers alike. So we talk about a lot in our communities, the ways that slavery and racism and colonization has used white supremacy as a tool to really divide our, like, I want to say our culture from each other based on our experiences. And so during that time, it was pretty, pervasive for African American, Black American youth to say comments about Africans, and then also Africans saying comments about Black Americans based on their perceptions of what they were like, not accounting for the individual intergenerational and traumatic experiences that both of our communities have had across the world. And so when the participants kind of got to that stage of realizing, for some of them, unfortunately, I remember one participant mentioning that it was during 2014 when Tamir Rice was murdered by a white man. That's kind of when they were like, oh, shoot, like this could happen to me or someone in my family because they look like me. The kid wasn't even speaking. Like, it wasn't like he heard an accent or anything like that. Like, it was just solely off the, fact that that man was racist. And so that's kind of those type of experiences that we all see and that vicariously traumatize us, unfortunately, are some of the experiences that I think other immigrant individuals see, and it awakens them to what is really going on in the world and how terrible like racism is and how important it is for us to be aware of our racial identity and our history in that way.
Yeah, and from what you're saying, it seems like one of the ways that people could potentially prepare themselves for life in the U.S. is to learn the history.
Yeah.
Which is something I had to do at some point. I had to kind of say, I need to learn more about American history, and what's led up to the way things are now. And I think the other part too is that folks in the education system need to teach kids about other countries too, and about the history of colonization and things like that. So I think there's some work to be done for people to kind of understand each other. And then there's just some things that it's hard to teach. You're just gonna learn it through experience.
Yeah.
And I think the cultural part of it that's a part that kind of just comes through life. Some of the differences in culture.
Mm-hmm.
So how did the participants kind of cope? What helped them to get through this? Did they say anything about that?
Yeah, honestly, from my perspective of having gone through, the interviews and even like during the conversations, a lot of them didn't have very adaptive or healthy coping mechanisms. Not that they had negative or maladaptive ones, but they just didn't really have mechanism that they were using to cope besides just persisting. They talked a lot about their perseverance and how resilient they are, which are all, traits that as Black people we possess because of our, history. And those are great traits to have to help us to be able to endure a lot of the circumstances that we're in. And it is important for us to be able to have coping mechanisms that help us live and thrive, not just, go through like, I can't remember what the word is, but just kind of going through the motions on a daily basis. So, but then the ones who did mention some things, like they talked about having friends who were within their culture. So those who had friends who were also immigrant individuals, other Black immigrants, also connecting with other Kenyans. A couple of them mentioned leaning into sports. So soccer or football is pretty big in Kenya. So some of them used athletics to be able to connect with other folks, even if there were individuals from other cultures that didn't necessarily listen to them in class or respect them much in class. When they were on the field playing, it was almost like a different experience, and they were able to form friends in that way. They also mentioned being able to just go to church. That was something that some of them like really held on to when they were younger. And in some ways it changed as they were growing up and realized other ways that they could cope. Um, at the time, none of them mentioned anything about therapy or seeking help. It's pretty taboo in the culture to even consider that because the and this is not every Kenyan household, but the notion of we don't talk about our family business with strangers, especially not with white people or these Americans, and letting them know like what's going on. That wasn't something that was that wasn't something that was appreciated. And so they didn't really talk about anything that had to do with counseling or therapy until we got to the conversation about currently in their emerging adulthood age. That's when they realized, I have somebody used the term mental trauma that has been blocking them from moving forward and healing. That's when they kind of started being like, okay, you know what, like, I think I need to talk to somebody, or I need to be able to get support to help me with a lot of things that I'm not even able to make sense of on my own.
So later on, they're able to kind of reflect on and think about mental health services. But when they were younger,
Yeah.
difficult to really go there. And their families may or may not have brought them to services or really believed that that was something they should do.
Yeah. I think the idea was that, like, it is a hard time. It's going to take you time to transition. Like, you'll be fine. Just keep pushing. This whole narrative of like, just keep going. And you can only be so adaptable and, independent and resilient until there is more that needs to be handled to figure out like what's really going on and how you can be better supported.
I mean, it's just the immigrant way, right? Just keep pushing. Just keep keep your head down, keep going.
And something that I actually thought of too, that I was having a conversation about yesterday is that history of Kenyans first voluntarily immigrating to the U.S. because of the Airlift Generation and educational purposes, how it's still very evident now. There's this, I think I would say in other Black immigrant cultures as well, education is so highly revered that this idea of excellence and chasing success in that way is something that has also put a high amount of stress on Kenyan youth, like to perform. The pressure is so much that to the point that for some people it ends up manifesting into anxiety, depression, feelings of worthlessness if they're not able to attain some of those expectations, even feelings of hopelessness. And for some in the community, to the point where they're completing suicide because they don't feel like they are able to, take that pressure anymore.
Well, yeah, I mean, the implications are great. And so it's, I feel encouraged that the people in the study, as they got older, did kind of consider the idea of seeking professional mental health services. And the hope is that over time, we can change the narrative and find the appropriate kind of services for them. People who would take the time to read up about their culture and try to educate themselves and also be able to provide the kind of care that people need.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for coming on the show. Any final kind of thoughts about the study or about things that AmeriKenyans can do to help themselves?
Yeah, I think, thank you so much for having me. I think having these conversations is really helpful because it does allow other people to see that what they're going through is not, they're not on their own, and it's not wrong to be feeling how they are. I feel like there's a lot of shame around not being able to handle what you're going through, or there's pressure to be strong, to be resilient, to be this like superhuman individual, especially because of that pressure you might be receiving from being a first generation immigrant, or, my parents did all this for me and look at where they came from and where they've made it to. And so like, I have to basically go above and beyond. And I still feel that in some ways. And also it's okay to get help to just talk about some of those things. It doesn't have to be at the point where you feel like you are suffering, but just as like, routine maintenance, the same way we get checkups with a doctor, might go to the dentist for a cleaning, just to be able to have someone who is, a neutral party, hopefully conscious about the things that are going on in the world, and conscious about a lot of other like isms that can be able to hold a space for you to feel supported. It's okay to do that, and to allow yourself to go through like the healing process and not feel like you're alone in it. And then also just speaking to other people in conversations about things like that. I think that also helps to break down the stigma that mental health, like seeking mental health, means that there's something wrong with you. When really like our goal as humans should be to like actualize and to spread love, and we won't be able to spread love and healing if we are not, feeling healed ourselves.
No, I'm glad that you said that. That idea that you can go to see a therapist, even if there's not some kind of crisis going on.
Yeah.
I think I think researchers found that a lot of times in the Black community, seeking mental health is very crisis driven.
Yeah.
And so that kind of has a lot of implications. Things like it gives you less choice over who you see. It gives you more emergency room visits and more hospitalizations and things like that. Whereas if you were to seek mental health services earlier, just go for checkups, just go to, talk about what's going on. It can help to reduce crises, reduce ER visits, reduce hospitalizations, and just help you to understand yourself better. Sometimes people just go to a therapist just to understand themselves better, to understand their family better, that sort of thing. And that's okay too. It doesn't mean that something's wrong with you.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought in that medical perspective, because, I feel like Black immigrants do value the opinions of like, medical doctors, lawyers, things like that a lot. But to also like speak to the science behind that is very helpful. And also just like a, grand resource to kind of share, the Association of Black Psychologists is a good, starting point to be able to seek services and supports that are specific to Black folks, conscious, culturally affirming care. And they also do these things called the Sawubona healing circles, which mirrors our collectivistic culture of being in community with each other, speaking about what's going on, either whether it's present, current events, or whether it is specific things that are going on within like your communities. You can also request for a facilitator to come in and help kind of facilitate or help those healing conversations. So that's a resource to look up for the Association of Black Psychologists. They have it on their website.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that resource.
Yeah.
Thanks again for coming on the show. And thanks for all of you out there that have been listening. You've been listening to Black Mental Health Matters. Today, we've been talking about AmeriKenyans. I've been joined by Dr. Onwong'a, who just successfully defended her dissertation last month and is going to be graduating with her PhD in counseling psychology. So I'll see you guys, again next week. I'll talk with you again next week. Thanks for joining Black Mental Health Matters, and have a great week.